Without being too grand about it, what's in these boxes is the identity of the Isle of Man, really. It's little pieces of the story of the island from the first period of human habitation.
There are things that are less common today than there used to be, and so having a record of that abundance and where they've been found is really useful.
Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Exploring Island Heritage. Today we're going behind the scenes again to find out a little more about the archaeology and natural history collections. But why are the collections important? Laura McCoy is Curator of Natural History for Manx National Heritage.
We have a really good representation of the natural history of the island, so I think a lot of people think of natural history collections as just stuffed, weird-looking animals with strange googly eyes that make people feel uncomfortable. We don't, well, we do have a couple of those actually, but but we actually do have some very good quality taxidermy, which looks like it can get up and walk away. But we also have a large entomological collection, a herbarium, a fungi collection, bryophytes, so mosses and lichens, and shells, fossils, minerals. So yeah, basically nests, skins, eggs, you name it. Basically, if it's natural, we've got a bit of it. Sometimes more than one bit, sometimes we've got several. What's interesting about natural history collections is each specimen is a snapshot in time. So people would maybe open a drawer in a collection and see 100 blue-tit skins. When I talk about skins, so think of a taxidermy specimen, but it hasn't been posed to look like it's alive. It'll just be lying flat, like it's asleep. So you might open a drawer and you'd see a lot of bird skins, all of the same species, and you go, well, why do you have all of those? Well, if you imagine that it's a species which has a niche, so an ecological niche, so choughs occur on cliff faces and they need very short grass land to feed. That's how they feed. That's their niche. You won't find them in a dense forest. That's not where they live. So if you find a chough and you prepare it as a specimen, that's a record of that habitat in that place at that time. And of course, as we can tell, our environment is changing hugely, partly because of us, partly because of other reasons. And so to have a record of how it's changing, all you have to have is that specimen. You'll be able to say, well, I know that was there at that time because that species was there at that time. So having those old collections, so having if you collected a representative of a species every year and you had been collecting them for 200 years, and then all of a sudden you can't collect them in the same place anymore because that habitat doesn't exist, all of a sudden you're proving that a change has happened. And why is it happening? Is it something that you need to look at and monitor or try and save or preserve? Or what if somebody wants to, say, reclaim a habitat? Say a land has been drained for farming many years ago, but it's decided that that land isn't useful or economically viable to farm anymore, so they'd like to recreate what was there before. Well, if you've got a record of all the species that were there, you've got a good idea of where to start. So people think that they're just like weird things for people to look at, but actually it's a record of the earth.
So is it about creating timelines then?
Yeah, definitely. But also you have to have the expertise and the knowledge to know what to collect and when and where and why. So you don't go out and just arbitrarily collect. What you would do is maybe there's something that you want to purposefully monitor or that you think is vulnerable that you want to keep a track of. So it's very concerted, but also as well it is useful. So people do come in and offer me specimens, so things that they may have found. So they'll have found a dead bird in their garden, and sometimes I will keep those specimens because they are useful, and I'll think, oh well, maybe there's not that many of those. Or think of the sparrow. 10 a penny, like 100 years ago, people would think, oh, they're a pest or they get everywhere, they're like locusts. And now sparrows across are becoming really they're not rare exactly, but they are threatened officially. They are threatened as a population. You hardly see any. And the thing is what you get is a creep, you get a biological creep of the environment that we see today and that we're used to is not the same as the environment that our grandparents and our great-grandparents see. So, you have to make sure that you keep in people's memory what we have and what we have lost.
Curator of Natural History for Manx National Heritage, Laura McCoy. We'll be returning to the island's natural history later in the programme. But first, another of M&H's collections contains archaeological finds. Allison Fox is Curator of Archaeology.
We are standing in the archaeology store of the Manx Museum down in the basement where nobody really gets to see, but this is where we hold the national collections of the archaeological artefacts. So we have material that ranges in date from the very earliest human habitation in the Isle of Man, the Mesolithic period, so about 8000 BC, right up until shipwreck material that comes from the 1800s and the 1900s. Lots of different kinds of material, so as you'd imagine from prehistoric period, lots of flint implements, again going right through lots of pottery and lots of Viking treasure as well down here.
So what's the time span for this being collected?
The earliest collected artefacts we have in this store probably date from the mid-1800s to the late 1800s, but it was really in the early 1900s that there was a movement on the Isle of Man to really push for a national museum where these artefacts from the Isle of Man could be kept. So it's really collecting of archaeological artefacts on the island really started with real enthusiasm, I think really in the early 1900s.
And it's rows and rows of shelves with boxes and boxes and boxes on them. What is actually in the boxes?
I think, without being too grand about it, what's in these boxes is the identity of the Isle of Man, really. It's little pieces of the story of the island from the first period of human habitation, and anything that humans have used or have found or have dropped or have left behind them, left by the wayside, all of that material can be interpreted as archaeological artefacts. So we have, for example, quite a lot of flint tools and implements. There was a particular collector, Alan Skillen, in the north of the island. He did a lot of field walking, and we have literally tens of thousands of pieces of flint from his collections that he kindly donated to us. We also have artefacts from Viking burials, so as well as Viking treasure, we also have iron items, so the odd cauldron that was buried with the Vikings, swords, knives, spearheads. We also have items from the maritime history of the Isle of Man, so we have shipwreck material which might include parts of the ships themselves but also the contents of ships. We have a lot of water-worn pottery from a particular shipwreck off the south coast of the Isle of Man, which doesn't look much in itself but did enable the wreck to be identified and dated to 1834 as a general cargo ship. And we also have as well in the maritime collections remains of the wreck of the HMS Racehorse, which was the wreck that really was the catalyst for Hillary to start pushing for what became the RNLI.
Now, in terms of the way they're stored, is everything in here stable? How do you keep an eye on that sort of thing?
Our conservator keeps an overall eye on the stores in the Manx Museums anyway. Most of the material that we have is fairly robust. Some items of prehistoric iron are particularly vulnerable, particularly fragile, so we try and keep those in a very stable environment. The key thing is really not to have any extremes either end. It shouldn't be too dry or too humid. As long as we can keep something stable sort of in the middle range, then things are pretty much fine. A lot of the soil over here on the Isle of Man is quite acidic, so that means that a lot of fragile and organic things don't survive anyway, so they don't turn up in archaeological excavations or as chance finds. But we do have some waterlogged wood, for example, and some waterlogged leather that came up from the excavations when the dockyard at the Nautical Museum where the Peggy was, when that was excavated a few years ago. So we have some material like that needs a little bit more attention, but generally, as long as everything's kept fairly stable, everything's quite happy. The idea behind the National Collections is that everything is available to study. So we do get researchers coming in from time to time asking us if they can have a look in depth at particular areas of the collection. And that's great for us because we can't do all the research ourselves. So we are very heavily reliant on other people taking an interest and looking in depth at part of the collections. The fact that all this archaeological material exists means that people can reassess the history of the Isle of Man. They can look again at what we think might have been what the Isle of Man looked like 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. With scientific techniques of archaeological investigation improving all the time, then we can find out a lot more from one particular type of artefact, or in the case of human remains, for example, then we can find out more about that individual without doing too much damage to the actual remains of that person as well.
You'd have to know what you were looking for if you came in here.
Yes, you would have looked on our fantastic database. We have a Grand Museum database, and in theory, every single artefact should have a location on that database. So if somebody wanted to see a particular piece of pottery from the excavations 30 years ago, then in theory I should be able to go straight to that box. And usually I can. We have some areas of the collections, some of the very earliest collected artefacts where the provenance isn't quite so good, so we know that perhaps we've got a collection of flint that came from the Isle of Man, but we don't know any more detail about it, so they are less well catalogued than the artefacts that have got the full provenance.
So when something does come into the museum, when something's donated, how do you work out what it is?
Sometimes it's very quick, sometimes it takes a little bit longer. We have legal requirement over here in the Isle of Man that any find of an archaeological artefact of any type has to be reported. So that means that we have an advantage over here, that we know when anything is found, so not like some of our neighbours, they have voluntary reporting of some kinds of material. What that means though is we get brought in all kinds of things, all sorts of things, which is fantastic, and we'd much rather see things and say, I think that's maybe a bit more modern, than not see something. A lot of the time things look like something that's already in the collection, so a lot of it is comparison. So for example, recently we've had a copper alloy decorative mount reported to us, and we know what that is because it's similar to other items that we've already got in the collections and other items elsewhere. Sometimes it takes us a little bit more research, especially if something is perhaps not in the best physical condition. Sometimes it can take a little bit more detective work, but we have contacts with museums elsewhere and other archaeologists, so we can usually, if we don't know immediately, then we can usually find out what something is.
Curator of Archaeology, Allison Fox. And we'll hear about more of the items held in those stores a little later in the programme. You're listening to Exploring Island Heritage, and on this week's programme we're finding out about some more of the national collections held in the care of Manx National Heritage. We heard earlier in the programme about why the natural history collections play an important role in charting the island's history. But what sort of items are collected? Laura McCoy again.
So we are in the entomology store. We have, if you imagine, there are lots of wooden cabinets with quite slim drawers, and when you open those drawers they are filled with dozens, if not hundreds, of invertebrates or insects. So we can open drawer now, and I will show you an example. So this is a part of the Bailey collection, and you can tell here by the way that the insects have been mounted that they're on quite old paper. So this is quite an old collection, and it's very varied. In the drawer that I'm looking at, you've got some chrysomelids, which are like jewel looking beetles. They're iridescent green, vibrant, very, very pretty. You've got some tiger beetles. You've got a big selection here, some devil's coach horse beetles, and they're carnivorous. We've got some cockchafer beetles or maybugs that people often seen. They sort of hear them before they see them, and they'll hit your lights when you've got them on at night time, and they're lovely. Probably one of the biggest beetles that many people will see. And also some really, really teeny tiny little beetles, which are sort of the size of a pinhead, which are, just really, really sweet. But again, it's a different species. I think many people see tiny things and, they just brush it off or think, oh, it's a gnat or something. But actually, there are so many tiny different species of animals that people just don't realise are there. It's this whole little microcosm that is really varied. For instance, micromoths, there are hundreds of species of micromoths, and they're tiny little things, and often when you look at them under the microscope, their wings will look like feathers, like they don't have that sheen, glass-like sheen of a wing, an invertebrate or an insect wing. It'll look feather-like, and that's because they're so tiny that the surface tension that wing structure creates in the earth, they kind of swim through the air, because to them it feels thicker because they're tiny. So it's kind of cool. They deal with a whole different mechanics because they're so small, so they experience the earth in a very different way than we do.
And is everything in here, everything in the stores, is it peculiar to the Isle of Man, or maybe not peculiar to the Isle of Man, but specific to the Isle of Man?
Yes, so the majority of the collections that the Manx Museum hold are Manx, and that's because, well, we can't compete with the Natural History Museum in terms of, you know, having a worldwide collection, and nor would we want to. We don't need to. What we represent is the Isle of Man, and we do that very well, and we do that better than anywhere else, and that's the same as all regional museums. They all specialise in their region better than anywhere else, and that's the way it should be. I mean, even if you went to the Natural History Museum, which everybody looks at as like the pinnacle, and they have everything of everything, well, no, they don't. We have more Manx stuff than they do. I mean, they do have some Manx things, but yeah, we are the holders of that treasure.
What else have we got in here? I mean, we've been looking at some beetles there. I mean,
Yeah.
how varied are the natural history collections? I mean,
well, we have everything. So, you know, as I was saying before, we have moths and butterflies. We have lots of moths and butterflies. So days gone by, people did collect a lot of moths and butterflies. Yes, we do have a lot of what we call Lepidoptera, is the group of butterflies and moths. They're very pretty, but again, if they've got good data with them, they are that snapshot in time. So there are things that are less common today than they used to be, and so having a record of that abundance and where they've been found is really useful. So, you know, just because we have maybe a lot of tortoiseshell butterflies, that doesn't matter, because that's a record of what those animals were experiencing at that time. So
how good was the data that was collected in the past?
some of it's excellent. You know, we do have specimens that are 100 years old, but really what you want when it was collected and where it was collected and by who. And the more accurate location you can give, so we often refer to things like grid reference numbers, but even just a very good description. So sometimes we'll have, you know, Ballabeg Farm in wherever, and well, that's pretty accurate. I mean, you can get super accurate to, like, you know, 10 metre squared or metre squared precision, but even just, you know, narrowing it down to a location can be very, very useful. So yeah, so some of the old collectors were, you know, because actually, I mean, even Charles Darwin and people before him, or even people in like the 16th century, you know, if they attached good data to that specimen, then it makes it valuable to science. If you don't have data, it's not meaningless, because you can still get things like genetic analysis from it, but a lot of the way that data or information can be used is lost if you don't have the locality and the date that you found it. So yeah, it does make a huge difference. If you took all the labels off our specimens, oh yes, it would be a bad day. We have also a freezer. So when people bring things in, obviously we don't want them to get very smelly, so we put them in the freezer. We also use freezers as quarantine. So believe it or not, considering how old and dry a lot of this collection is, you'd think, well, nobody would want to eat that. But there are animals, beetle larvae and some types of moth that eat that material because it's still organic. I mean, you know, you still get moths eating your jumpers. So, you know, that if it's organic, there will be a creature out there that wants to eat it. So we have to be very careful. We inspect our collections regularly. And if we see that there is any start of an infestation, we will freeze it. We freeze it for about a week, and we have freezers that are quite cold, and then we take them out, and that will kill off the adults and hopefully the larvae and eggs as well.
So how do you do that? Do you take it out of its case and just put it in a freezer?
Yeah. So as you see, when I pulled out those drawers, all of these drawers can be taken out of their cabinets, and which is useful for display as well. So I could put one of those drawers in a gallery as well, but or I can take them out and about and use them as an educational tool. But it also means that they're very transportable, and I can wrap them up and put them in the freezer, which is very useful. Or if you had a very serious infestation, you could put the whole cabinet in the freezer. But yeah, we try and keep on top of it, so it's only one drawer or two.
Curator of Natural History, Laura McCoy. It's already too late to book a place on the tour of the Natural History store being held as part of this year's Heritage Open Days. All of the places for that particular event are already taken. But there are a number of other opportunities to find out about aspects of the island's heritage during the first 2 weekends of October, many of which you don't need to book a place for. Full details of all of those events can be found on the Manx National Heritage website. Finally, on this week's programme, we return to the Archaeology Collections to find out more about some of the more sensitive items held in the stores, from Curator of Archaeology, Allison Fox. So this is a different store.
Yeah, this is the store that is dedicated to the human remains. There have been a lot of questions asked about the ethics behind keeping human remains in museum stores over the past 2 decades, really, in the museum industry. And a few years ago, we thought that it would be appropriate to have a store where we put the human remains and no other type of artefact, just so it's a little bit separate, away from the main collections, and just a little bit more respectful, I guess.
There's been an interesting balance there between carrying out your job in terms of dealing with the material, but also, like you say, treating it with some sort of respect.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I know when I was doing my training many years ago, I worked on a site in Kent, and that had quite a lot of human remains on, and the attitude was, not particularly of the organisation, but of the individual diggers, was quite blasé about it, lifting the skeletons and things. And perhaps it's something as I get older, I'm not sure, but now I think because, my job is essentially to help care for the collections, the Manx National Collections, I feel that the remains need to be treated with a little bit more respect than you would, perhaps a piece of iron that's come from the ground. It's slightly different, I think, when you're talking about a human skeleton, or the cremated remains of someone from the Bronze Age.
And what sites have these remains come from?
We have a lot of remains here from Rushen Abbey in particular, from before Manx National Heritage took ownership of the site. There have been excavations done there in the 70s and 80s, and we have quite a lot of remains from there. The condition of the human remains from Rushen Abbey is really, really good, very robust. They're all what we call inhumations, which is basically when somebody is buried whole, so they're not cremated, so it's inhumation as opposed to cremation. So we have the very well preserved skeletal remains, and we are always looking again for new information about these remains. The good thing about having such robust and well preserved remains is that specialists can come in and look at the material to see about the conditions these people lived in, whether they were male, female, child, adult, whether they suffered from any diseases, any stresses that were put on their skeleton, and so we can actually find out a little bit more about these people that we've got in the stores. We also have human remains from the Peel Castle excavations in the 1980s. They are in much worse condition than the Rushen Abbey skeletons. It's just really to do with soil conditions, soil acidity. And again, there was a report done on the excavations in Peel Castle, so we know a lot more about the people who are buried there. Probably one of the most famous one is the Pagan Lady of Peel Castle. And recently we've been able to allow access to researcher Dr. Lee Simmons to do some isotope analysis on the remains of the Pagan Lady. Isotope analysis can, amongst other things, tell you where somebody spent the early part of their life, so whether they were local to the Isle of Man or not. And the results suggested that the Pagan Lady wasn't local to the Isle of Man. We also have the skeletal remains from the early Christian cemetery at Balladool, the site just outside Castletown, most famous for the Viking boat burial. But the Viking boat burial was inserted on top of a pre-existing Christian cemetery dating to about AD 500 to 700. So we've got a lot of people from the excavations there that were done in the 1940s. Again, we've done recent isotope analysis. Dr. Katie Hemer did some isotope analysis, and one of the individuals looks as if she may have certainly spent her early years in the Mediterranean or the north coast of Africa. So again, we've got all these collections, and if we can get more people to look at them and to do research, we can start putting the flesh on the bones, if you like.
Over the years, the techniques for actually deciphering what things are must have changed an awful lot.
I think we've got a lot more tools at our disposal now. One of the most important techniques is visual, is actually looking at the human remains, looking at the bones and actually, seeing what signs of anything is there. Scientific techniques now really have improved so much. When I first started out in archaeology, to get a decent, reliable radiocarbon date, for example, you did need more or less a full, long bone to do that. Now you need a gram of material. The techniques are so much better, so much more refined. The results are much better as well. So we've got a lot more tools, but always the first point of call is just to pick up something and look at it, and see what that tells you and take it from there. I think the other advantage over the old-fashioned traditional visual way of looking at things is it doesn't destroy anything either, unless you drop something. It's non-destructive. So whereas you don't need too much of a piece of bone to do radiocarbon dating, you do still need to destroy a little bit. So as much that you can do without destroying any part of the sample is by far and away the best. And on the Isle of Man, there is a licensing system. So, for example, if somebody wanted to do some radiocarbon dating on an archaeological artefact, they have to get a licence from MNH before they do that. So that's a great way for us to be able to monitor and also advise on projects that may want to destroy parts of, certainly if it's the national collections.
Curator of Archaeology for Manx National Heritage, Allison Fox. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be exploring more island heritage at the same time next week.